Is the Second Amendment racist? Some anti-gun activists will tell you that it is. They claim that the United States recognized the right to keep and bear arms all because they wanted to keep African Americans enslaved. But when you look at the history of the Second Amendment, you find that this claim is simply bogus. Today I'm going to give you 3 reasons why we know that this argument that the Second Amendment is racist is simply not true. Hey folks, I'm Mark and welcome to the Four Boxes Diner. Here's a headline that recently graced the cover of the New York Times book review. Quote, "Was the constitutional right to bear arms designed to protect slavery?" That was the question presented. The book under review, Carol Anderson's The Second, which tried to argue that the answer to the question was yes. But even the New York Times reviewer essentially admitted that Anderson's argument that the Second Amendment was racist were unconvincing. In fact, the historical evidence is so clear that the Second Amendment is not founded in racism that it's simply absurd even to ask whether or not the Second Amendment was intended or designed to protect slavery. Here's the first reason why the Second Amendment is not racist. You see, the Second Amendment was based on the ancient right to bear arms based upon the English Declaration of Rights from the year 1689. Now you can check out an entire video I did about the English Declaration of Rights and how it inspired our founding fathers to incorporate the Second Amendment in a video that I will link in the description below. And again, the English Declaration of Rights had nothing whatsoever to do with slavery in the United States or anywhere else for that matter. If you go back in time, you see the English Declaration of Rights was all about enshrining a right to arms because the Catholic King James II had disarmed Protestants in England beforehand. So when the English overthrew King James II, a robust, serious, radical Catholic, they then installed the Protestant monarchs William and Mary. And it was the Protestant monarchs William and Mary working with Parliament that enacted a right to arms to make sure that that abuse of disarming the population never happened again. Now today in America, the anti-gunners want you to think that the Second Amendment was instituted by our founders in order to keep slaves in bondage. But the English inspiration for the Second Amendment was obviously unrelated to any kind of suppression of a domestic slave population or a domestic African slave population. And why do we know this? It's really quite simple. You see, the English did not have a domestic slave population when they enacted the English Declaration of Rights. Again, the forefather or grandfather of the Second Amendment. The second reason we know that the Second Amendment is not and was not about protecting slavery is because 4 of the original 13 states recognized a right to bear arms before you had a Bill of Rights and thus before you had a Second Amendment. If you go by what the anti-gunners are arguing, right, you'd expect that all of those states would have been slave states, right? In the South. Because if you buy into what the anti-gunners are trying to say, they're arguing that you as a state somehow need a right to keep and bear arms in order to preserve the institution of slavery. But again, if you look at American history, it turns out that 3 of the 4 states that already had a right to bear arms before the Second Amendment, right, before the Second Amendment was adopted, were actually northern states. That's northern states that had already abolished slavery before the United States Constitution was written. I'll give you a couple examples. In 1776, right, Pennsylvania became the first state to guarantee in their state constitution the right to bear arms. 4 years later, Pennsylvania passed the first act abolishing slavery. Okay, it was the first state that had a state act abolishing slavery. That was Pennsylvania. But then look at 1777, the state of Vermont adopted the first state constitution that both included a right to arms and also abolished slavery. Of course, Vermont, needless to say, is a northern state with a lot of snow. Okay? And in 1780, the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights included a right to bear arms. A couple of years later, Massachusetts courts declared slavery to be unconstitutional throughout the state or Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So instead of the slave states, it was the anti-slavery northern states that pioneered the right to keep and bear arms in America and in constitutional doctrine. The third reason why the Second Amendment is not racist has to do with how it was adopted. When the original Constitution was written in 1789, it did not have a Bill of Rights. But as the states began to debate whether to ratify the Constitution, a bunch of them asked to have a new federal government guarantee certain individual rights as really fundamental and important. And it was James Madison who eventually collected these ideas and drafted what became our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Now, if the anti-gunners claim is correct, right, then you would expect that the slave-holding South would be the ones pushing for an amendment in the federal Constitution to protect a right to keep and bear arms. But in fact, that's not what happened. In fact, historically we see that it was mostly the northern states that pressed for a Second Amendment to be included in the federal Bill of Rights. Let's take an example. At the Massachusetts Ratification Convention over the Constitution, Samuel Adams, that's right, Samuel Adams, founding father, insisted that Congress should not be able to prevent the people of the United States from keeping their own arms. Similarly, Pennsylvania asked the federal government to enact an amendment recognizing, quote, that the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and their own state of the United States or for the purpose of killing game. New Hampshire, New York, and Rhode Island all also called for the protection of the right to bear arms in the Bill of Rights. So think about that for a second. This is New Hampshire, New York, Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania all asked for federal protection of the right to keep and bear arms, and all of those states were, if you don't know your geography, those were northern states, and none of them had slavery. So let's wrap up. It's simply ridiculous, in my view, to say that the Second Amendment is racist. Here are the three reasons why. First, the Second Amendment is based on the English right, or the English Declaration of Rights from 1689 that has nothing to do with slavery or race. And number two, the Second Amendment followed in the footsteps of state arm guarantees we see in the anti-slavery northern states, okay? And third, and last but not least, several of the non-slave states in the North were the ones that actually pushed for the Second Amendment to be included in the Bill of Rights. So the real issue, by the way, is not that the Second Amendment is racist. It's that America, for far too long, denied African Americans their full rights of citizenship, including the right to keep and bear arms. All right, thanks for joining me here today at the Four Boxes Diner, where we serve fresh, hot, Second Amendment news and analysis. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe and please spread the word. So again, we'll see you next time at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.